Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval French courtesy literature. Some of you will escape as soon as I say this because, we don't talk literature very much and say, oh my god, this is boring. Well, no, it's actually fascinating. There is also a lot of pictures, and I know that you like pictures in general. I'm kidding. But it's one of those chapters that when you make a channel or essentially based on medieval history, and that, as you know, talks about France perhaps more than the average because, first of all, for, say, an historical objective necessity, but secondly also because there isn't so much around that, right? But it's difficult to talk about France in spite of the precocious success of its national monarchy and the cultural dominance in the West. And it's as if the idea that this system was capable of ruling from the center and subsuming this fact various cultural influences and giving it a gradually, say, unitary direction, aside from, of course, the heterogeneity of the cultures, the fact that, in fact, when we say French, we should point to not much the political, the kingdom, right? The kingdom districtuation stemming from the Western French, but rather just ethnically, linguistically, the North, right, in this world. But still, the idea that a court, right, of noblemen that rules over this enormous Atlantic system and that manages fundamentally to establish itself towards mostly the end of the Middle Ages, as we'll fundamentally discuss today, also as a model of leadership and of way of life, right, and system of values, is something that you understand is not really, in tune with the way our, stressing of the concept of diversity and all this sort of, at the end of the day, relativistic and deconstructionistic mentality, would like to appreciate. In any case, courtly literature is also an enormous deal. Today we'll use the expression courtesy, right? Every once in a while, I guess maybe also courtly. But the idea is that the books we're looking at today are not just the courtly genres just per se, but specifically that part of didactic literature that, of course, was mostly destined to the establishment, broadly meant, not necessarily the court, but say at least those who also inspired to be part of the royal entourage, and of course also one of the provincial peers of France, and the general nobility that was being stratified, right, segmented ever more towards the end of the Middle Ages. Made lots of videos about, for example, the French army organization in this regard, how in the 15th century the ordnance companies came around, with which system, the struggles between the monarchy and the nobility in France. So today we don't talk about that, but just bear in mind that politically that's the background, right? And that these very men we're looking at, essentially providing with these models, or just providing them for those who were in charge, were in fact taking part in that specific system. So it's not literature just for us to detach ourselves from, as very often, unfortunately, given that essentially historians of literature, so linguists rather, or literary experts rather than actual historians, mostly deal with these topics at least in a definitional way. Today we just look at the general picture. Of course, I don't specialize in literature, but right, it's important to talk about this. And courtesy books covered topics from religion and ethics to social awareness, social conduct. This was not even a genre that had just been born in France, right? There was at this point in Western Europe, between Italy, Germany, etc., England, a significant affirmation of this, this codes of conduct, right? That could stem also from different political backgrounds. Could be urban patricians as much as, in fact, feudal nobility, right? So, but the the Ancien Regime as the foundation of, in fact, of an order, right, a highly hierarchical and stratified one, was being affirmed exactly in these later centuries. And in a way, in order to make the elite up to those standards, the codes of conduct were ever more classified, defined, affirmed for the actual imitational benefit, right, of the same, right, which is not simply to say, well, as, I don't know, chivalric literature, etc., this did not quite match with reality. It is a way of saying, look, we believe we are this, right, in front of the rest of the world, in front of God, right? And it's also a fascinating time because it's still the moment of the end of universalism, so there are somehow already some lay and modern values, emerging, albeit still within, like, you can't like fish for that and cutting away all the rest if you don't like it, because again you're a modernist or a secularist. Of course, these authors, even when appearing to us somehow, in fact, more familiarly sounding about a certain code of conduct that could be closer, at least, to the one that exists in today's time, were actually framed in a much more rigidly traditional background, and that must be actually reinforced as a general awareness, and also explaining the reason why, right? Which today I think it's not going to be easy to do in general, because it considers more or less those sets of values that we see here and there on the channel, especially through the traditional history videos, but that in fact must be observed from the actual analysis of the texts that today also we can't quite do. So I will just list, right, some of the most important authors' works describing their content, especially in the later ones, in the 15th century. We have the Ménagère of Paris, we have Christine de Pizan, we have really interesting works that the content of which can also be overviewed. So, while firmly normative in their bent, these courtesy books also showed an awareness of reality, right? And so also those aspects that, exactly for an exemplary reason, were highlighted, not fitting neatly under the rubric of their precepts, right? And so the moral lessons, the example, typical, also different literary genres that would essentially extract a moral out of such accidents, such wrongdoing, right? Such evil. And courtesy books appealed essentially both to an aristocratic readership and to this inspiring urban patriciate that was becoming, as we've seen often in France towards the later Middle Ages, ever more important, a bit as the city as the center of the province, right? And so in even Paris, of course, being so in the very heart of the monarchy, but let's say the as you know, also the bourgeois world being co-opted extensively by the Capetians, the Valois, in order to contain, to regulate further the nobility in those atrocious clashes that were taking place at this time. We really start with the 13th century because that's when essentially the feudal establishment is already profiled, right? It's actually expanding, it's rising further, right? Especially in France, where the Capetians have practically boomed and managed to reconquer the entire Western Frankish kingdom. And so a system that would enter in crisis as a consequence, because there was nothing strictly teleological about this in the following century, given that the feudal monarchy, the feudal state, settled forms that had been developed in the 13th century had been so, say, fastly established that they had to be reinforced further to avoid the big crisis of the 14th century. It was not really possible. So the 100 Years' War, the Jacquerie, the same French military defeats of the time, the sort of, in fact, division of the same France. Think about the House of Burgundy. There was the same one of the actual Valois ruling as kings of the country. So you really have a lot going on. You have still at the beginning of this period very strong connections between France and England that would of course remain also later. But here we're coming from the beginning at the beginning of the period from a as you know, a phase of essentially of Angevin Empire, so called, that just right now had been fundamentally undermined, with England going a bit more on her own in her insular dimension. And I made plenty of videos of this. There is also a series, as you know, of the various French vassal states that were essentially being absorbed by the Capetians mostly at this time, others still maintaining a significant autonomy until much later. Think about Brittany, etc. So there is a lot of compenetration of sources. That is also a very complicated topic today to explain, because just think about the influence of the Brittonic cycle, so mostly of a Celtic background coming from places like the same Britain and Bretagne, rather than the Germanic background that ultimately, in fact, also part of the same chivalric tradition stemmed from, right, and being pioneered a bit more by in fact, the Carolingian cycle, etc., but still being very much in a Romance sauce. And that's why we're talking about French literature in the first place. Briefly about the courtesy books history, the oldest known being actually from Germany in the mid-13th century. It's the Tannhäuser book of manners, which from the terms involved here, you understand, being part of, in fact, this broader epic chivalric tradition, but still inspiring further etiquette that would essentially develop and refine, as we will see now, throughout the following centuries, very often also on the basis of these early works. Another of the oldest known courtesy books of Germany is the learning poems of Vince Becke and Vince Beckin, written around 1220 by an anonymous author. The interesting fact about this works, like think about the Minnesänger, at least in Germany, but this is similar to other countries, were sometimes just, there was a lot of them, right? A lot of knights, a lot of, inspired people really just leaped out of this craft sometimes, and or used that as a spin-off, right? Some of the greatest mercenaries of this time, people with that apparently knew not even the slightest trace of any sense of human, of sensitivity towards somebody else's life, instead produce some of the single most beautifully potent and potently romantic and insightful and incredibly beautiful literature of this point. And the two things are strictly connected, by the way, as actually a dichotomy and as a complementary dynamic. The oldest known courtesy book from Italy is around the 1215 and 16. However, we know it in the German translation. It's called, in fact, the Welsche Gast, so essentially the foreign guest, right? By Thomasin for Zerclair, and that was, of course, destined here we see from Italy, but to a German audience, and or popularized, because there was an enormous circulation. I mean, French literature, for example, as you know, in Italy, in Germany, was a big deal, but I mean a real one, and especially during the 13th century, these countries were potently influenced by the Anglo-Frankish Gothic, right, style to all levels. The same goes for Spain, by the way, and so there is a lot of synthesis, right, a lot of hybrid between all these countries. In any case, the oldest known courtesy book from England, instead, is the one of the civilized man, right? The Liber Urbani in Latin, as a matter of fact, by Daniel of Beccles, and we are essentially at the beginning of the 13th century, or possibly even the 90s of the 12th. And this chronology is not random because, especially as far countries as France and England are concerned, and as we will see, in fact, the French were a bit procuring times as well in the second half of the 12th century. It was really from the last quarter of this that chivalry was strictly defined and codified and fundamentally corresponding to that process of lock of the former militia, the knightly one, between those who were, say, proper knights, right, and others just essentially militas. So the dubbing dimension becomes ever more important. There is essentially a narrower circle of nobility that takes control of the system, while other estates, the same knightly one at large, end up under them. Think about the ministeriales in Germany. Then there is the crisis of 14th century. The same goes for the Italian militas that get ostracized in the local communes. So you have an actual lock, right? In France, this happens through essentially the booming of the monarchy, and so the possibility from the same to confer enormous amount of land and power that had been taken out, say, I don't know, from the south and from the county of Toulouse, from the Cadres, from also from all the Angevin possessions, by the way, or almost all of them, to trustees, to the same actual members of the royal family, the peers of France, and so hiring, right, the power of this true class, in a sense. This is a process that occurs also in Spain. We have seen that. I've made lots of videos about late medieval politics, administration, institutions. You see that, yes, the nobility is dangerous, but it's easier, paradoxically, when compacted in a few heads that you can also marry into, right? It's something that happens also in Central Europe among the kings, the lords in Italy. So you have this happening pretty much everywhere. Right. In England, things are slightly more balanced, perhaps, but mostly because of the baronial prerogatives after the loss of France, etc. But even there, you still have in the entrenchment in their own prerogatives, of course, essentially an oligarchy that is crushing more or less all the rest, right? So I made plenty of videos on, I don't know, the autonomy of the 13th century English peasantry. You know, things that are really powerful in showing what actually the late Middle Ages again was. I'm repeating it in an oddly frequent way. Recently, there was actually no rise of the commoners whatsoever, right? There was just the rise of a few people that became incredibly more powerful than the others, while the crisis of Eurasia in the mid-14th century was essentially severing the legs of those even powerful commoners' realities that had been growing from before, right? So this is more or less the background. So we can think of courtesy books, broadly speaking, as vernacular works, not always, as we will see, and we've already observed before. For lay audiences, this is true, that teach things like etiquette, behavior, moral values, according to sex, for example, social status, right? And this books include works, by the way, in a variety of genres as they develop through essentially from the 12th to the 15th century, to which we stop. Actually, in the Renaissance, they kept having an importance as a literary genre, but at least we can't cover the entire thing now. What sources did they use? What was the, say, source of the authority, at least, the moral righteousness that they were presenting the reader with? Well, mostly and predictably biblical and historical exempla, such as, I don't know, the Dicta of Cato or Solomon, precepts of the church fathers, proverbs, but also other contemporary cultural references, I don't know, vernacular literature, customs. So the authors of courtesy literature defined what this entire world was now to come to be managed like, right? Defining what was really the appropriate behavior for men and women, mostly of the elite, but also of the rest, right? That was becoming essentially part of a massive clientele of their same lords, and thus, in a sense, mirroring even at a lower echelon, in fact, an order that is quite firmly reinforced, especially towards the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. By the way, if you're interested, I made a video about the transformation of the French monarchy exactly from the late 13th up to roughly the mid second half of the 14th century that can help a bit picturing this in a social sense and political one. So among the oldest vernacular didactic works in the Occitan enseignement, that means teaching, right? Like enseignement, like it would be like it, but more Languedoc fashion, of Garin Lebrun or Labrun. All right, we are in the second half of the 12th century, right? The author of Garin's biography, known as the Vida, right, in Occitan, states that he essentially went on warring to tell the ladies how they should have behaved, right? This is interesting. And we will see there is a lot of that in this type of genre. Garin's works is essentially made up by more than 100 verses. We are in a relatively early time, so these have they're contained, but they are sort of little works of art. They have as a theme the beauty of nature and essentially the deplorable state instead in which essentially the soul and the costumes, the mores of the time are bursting. However, Garin's principal theme is again the courtly behavior of women that in fact make the enseignement known as de la donzella, which stands for the enseignement of the girl, right? Or l'enseignement à la dama, so to the dame, to the woman. And it's definitely a type of work that is part of the medieval literary conduct to stimulate women to adapt to their husbands, right? To learn how to be complementary, right? In mood, right? In circumstances, to their men, right? In a traditional, of course, sense of completion of the couple. Garin also advises women to sing and act poetry for their hosts, which was habitually practiced. The sense was to show how essentially female chronic nature was essentially transfigured Apollonianly by the marriage, by their taming and possession by their husbands, right? And here we're talking about noble women, so women who really were that versed in it, because women, of course, were understood ancestrally as having this greater sensitivity and contact with the forces of nature that were the ones that the same husbands as knights were to tame and to mold right under their will. So their politeness, right, their politesse in this sense, was crucial in order to fulfill their role in the world. Another passage of the enseignement that is also famous advises women to greet and to introduce fundamentally the entertainers, so the minstrels fundamentally, and the poets that are there also for that task, right, as they are a bit like professional storytellers, and we are in the 12th century, still treasurers, guardians of very ancestral knowledge and deeds of, in fact, of warriors, of kings, of the great heroes of the past, right? And that also, however, at this point have been extensively, especially in the Occitan world, as you know, told of love and singing verses, melodies that are connected with this, and that are always actually part of the entire traditional background, except the French South was thought to be more sensual, more feminine, and so also conquered later by the virile, rigid, stern model of the North, right? And we can't digress. I made lots of videos about medieval Occitania. There is actually a playlist there that explains a bit the differences. Just last spring I made one about the Duchy of Aquitaine, so explaining the oldest, even through the figure of Eleanor, etc. In any case, the role of minstrels, poets, is quite relevant, right? Because the capacity of entertaining the court, having these values resonating and being expressed in the most effective way that could excite, in fact, the force, in this sense, mostly the darkest forces of the world, but to be tamed by their masters, was, in fact, an ongoing, forever ongoing theme, especially in this kind of more courtly, gentle literature, right? So again, the role of women was catalytic in the process, as much as one of these storytellers. It's a bit like the role that the shamans, to some degree, had in the ancestral society, that as being more in contact with some forces of nature, being able to express it, to bring it to the fore, even though they weren't considered for this reason male. They were thought to be sort of even borderline, right? At least in this world, yes, they were manly enough, as we've seen. Some were knights themselves, but the sense is that still a singer, a minstrel, is just an inferior compared to the great lord and master that has won all this already, and is just being reinforced by these voices singing for him, right? And also of his death, but challenging him, even in a sense, to be that capable of taming these more sensual forces. And similarly to the enseignement, we have only 8 other courtly didactic poems, the same genre. Excellent, right? The oldest estates poem, the Livre de Manières, so the Book of Manners by Etienne de Fougères, we are in the late 12th century, is dedicated to the Countess of Hereford, right? This was a Breton author, and so working at that time still at the Angevin court, right? And or at least having this influence also in England, and whenever this itinerating courts traveled, because that's also how the deal really was. And he expounds the role and laments of the failings of kings, clergy, knights, peasant, bourgeois, right? And both virtuous and immoral women, right? So this is a bit double way. This author is fascinating also because he was a chaplain of the same Henry II, by the way, at some point, starting from 1155, and eventually he was even elevated as Bishop of Rennes in Bretagne, a role that he occupied between 1168 and 1178. So he was a prelate, a clerk at the same time, and still in the 12th century, these are, especially in this part of Europe, the only people who can have this extensive education, right? They can also not just sing, right, songs and other sort of traditional folk tales at the end of the day that were just now being passed from the oral tradition to the written one, because they were, by the way, also so famous that there had been, up to that point, from the dawn of mankind, essentially an effective functional reliance on the oral tradition, right? So these times are definitely ones of somehow further stepping up in civilization, creating new layers, new roles. There is more reason around. This is the 12th century Renaissance, called also historiographically at times. And you have the need to stop and to reflect, to note, and to develop further, and to start experimenting also on this new basis, right, from the older forms, and together with the same stabilization of the courts that are passing from something, in fact, more ancestrally in movement, let's say, to something, in fact, much better base, and so capable also of treasuring, accumulating a given place, attracting all these figures, making them even competing with one another, right? Definitely, the century of greatest flourishing of courtly literature is the 13th. I've explained why the peak of chivalry, both in council and on the battlefield. At this point, royalty and aristocracy were seeking to foster noble conduct in their families. First of all, because they were getting ever more closely intertwined, while the rest of the aristocracy was somehow falling behind, and so the idea of being again up to higher standards compared to them was crucial to justify their leadership in the first place. So these works are largely, say, ideal in the measure in which, of course, reality was much bloodier and violent and more licentious and sensual, of course, than they would have liked it to be. But it was still a way to fix such values, right? That were, however, let's say, as we've seen before, that this was a moment of great excess, right? A person could be extremely violent, and we mostly are spoiled today by a sense of equality. We think that people were like a bit like all the same with one another, even when there was privilege or whatever. We have this sort of lay modern sense of, after all, those at the top are just a bunch of bombastic megalomaniacs, etc. These were actually at the time that qualitative of people to hold a massive system on their shoulders, and so they needed excess, right? Killing a peasant during a tournament that was carried out literally up there in the countryside, killing other people, breaking each other's bones, was completely normal, right? And nobody cared, because they knew that that system was able to, in fact, foster such value and capacity that otherwise could have not found another way of testing, of practice, of order, as a matter of fact. But again, the state was also affirming, especially in France. For example, the same Saint Louis IX, King of France, wrote separate letters of instruction to his son and his daughters, right? Essentially, to that high level of Christomimesis, essentially, that was to really inspire them in a sense of sacral monarchy, just like the French one was the most, right, of its times, with all its sacred mystique, its imperial and universalist tendencies. This will be evident also with the later rulers, Philip III, especially Philip IV, right? And Louis authored and sent the enseignements, or teachings, to his very son, Philip III. And in this letter you find how Philip, as the next king, should have followed the example, in fact, of Christ in order to be a moral leader. As you know, Louis IX was to, of course, criticize bitterly the mundane lifestyle of the nobility by somehow humiliating them, right? Visiting monasteries and starting to carry water together with the local monks, while making the other nobility ashamed for not having been as spiritually oriented as their leader. Louis IX is really a great figure. He was also a great warrior at the same time, so the sense was a bit like the one we've seen also in Augustus, in this other, examples of relative simplicity, but in that sense of greater strength that had to manifest just in that spiritual superiority. And of course, Louis, given this teachings, is quite relevant, especially considering that the letter to Philip III is estimated to have been written in 1267, so just 3 years before Louis' death, right? So with important concerns for the welfare of the kingdom in practice. The daughters naturally were reminded of the example of the Virgin and in all moral virtues, and definitely that was the true one advice of a saint. At the behest of Philip III, the Italian philosopher and theologian Egidio Colonna, Gilles de Rome, as they called him in French, who wrote the De Regimine Principum for the future King of France, Philip IV, known as the Fair. Right, Egidius was the son of Peter, the Count of Genazzano. These were again the Colonnese family. He took like the ecclesiastical career, but that would bring him to France. But he was essentially part of this Ghibelline clan. He was actually a student, a pupil of Saint Thomas Aquinas. So another connational, let's say, at the University of Paris, the most important theological studium in Europe, where he would later himself teach, right before becoming the general of the Augustinians and even the Archbishop of Bourges in 1295. We were literally at the peak of French papal Guelph Europe at the highest possible levels, right? So this guy could be properly the preceptor of Philip the Fair, right? For whom he wrote the De Regimine Principum, that would be, by the way, translated into French in the late 13th century as the Livre du Gouvernement de Roi. So, in fact, it should be the translation, but fundamentally the book of royal government. And this work has chapters on essentially domestic duties of women, the education of children. I mean, it's not just about the highest spheres of government that, however, are, of course, explained as far as especially the rectitude of princes in civil as military affairs were concerned. Right, Philip the Fair, as you know, was essentially the most powerful king of France, right, even more than his saint grandfather, and had to take a series of pretty harsh measures to make this system. It was starting to finally exhaust the growth, to make it work to hold it towards a more subtle dimension, right? And naturally, Egidius' work supported the effectiveness of monarchy as a form of government. Think about Philip IV really struggling against the same papacy, even though being allied with him. With talking Boniface VIII made multiple videos on this clash, a bit the imperial nature of the French monarchy that at this point was seeing Philip IV and Boniface VIII themselves claiming for them the title of Caesar, and the fact of also of emperors, right, and Holy Roman emperors in that case, given that the imperial situation was pretty low at that point, and literally these were the strongest, respectively, lay and spiritual powers in Europe, forming an axis but quarreling with one another. And just think how important it was for Aegidius to be in this kind of between, but supporting naturally a Thomistic order, a more rational approach to the same government, sort of more secular way of handling matter. You know how actually ruthless Philip really was, but if you look at his government in perspective, which is, he receives too much flack for actually having been a capable ruler independently from the outcome, given that it was incredibly difficult to maintain together with France. Really had become and required an enormous amount of wealth, so that even the clash with the papacy, the looting of the papal treasure, and the abduction of it to France, right in the Battle of Anagni, is something which really stands out as one of the most famous chapters, as shocking chapters in fact in medieval history. And consider that Aegidius was in fact of the same clan of Sciarra Colonna, that was, albeit Ghibelline traditionally, differently from the Orsini, the most powerful Roman families. They are actually citing Guillaume de Nogaret as the lawyer factotum of Philip IV in transgressing Boniface VIII. And so there you have even this clanic connection between the theory and the practice, well served. A royal mirror for princesses, the speculum dominarum, so obviously the mirror of the dames, the domine, right, by the theologian and bishop Durand de Champagne, is very famous. This also was translated into French as the Miroir de Dames in 9 manuscripts during essentially the 14th and 15th century, before the eventual adaptation in the Renaissance by Isambert de Saint-Léger. This translation in French is quite important because north of the Alps, Latin had, of course, remained as the official language of the system of government, etc. Vernacular had become a literary language earlier, and especially as far as not much treatise, but that aforementioned more sort of traditional literature, like the songs, the chansons de geste, etc. Not only, as we've seen here, but the importance of course, translating the original Latin work into vernacular is something that the French, that are, again, very precocious in their sense of national monarchy, carry out also for the very elite. It was incredibly proud to speak French already. There are 2 works also addressed to the lesser nobility. The anonymous Urbain le Courtois, we are in the second half of the 13th century, contained in 8 manuscripts, and the Enseignement de Robert de Haut. We are around 1260, right? These convey essentially lessons in courtesy and also behavior from father to son, right? The idea, of course, is that there is a divine hierarchy. Just biblically, you must honor God as much as your parents, and this was, of course, in the microcosm of the family, reflecting the wider one, the entire point, in all the sort of, in fact, transfigurational purpose and the sense of wisdom and of attainment, etc. There is quite practical advice, right, such as avoiding taverns and loose women, which seemed, and they were really a big deal, because especially the sons, right, we've seen it in the video about the motivation, the cost of university students very often could squander their entire father's wealth, that is essentially all what was needed to make them attend university, sometimes in this urban centers, literally gambling and paying prostitutes, and many people went really they lost everything in the process, like that. There are, say, more say practical issues, such as try not to scratch in public, right? Because it was just, you had to appear in that sort of stoic, elegant, immutable way that had to reflect your own virtue in the first place. Also, bodily aspects were actually very, very much considered at the time, right? People were extremely careful to evaluate beauty that was really a value morally, not just physically, because the two things were reflected. Illnesses were essentially a teller of what kind of vice, right, of sin, the person was guilty of, right, and so that was all a universal judgment attached to such things. Interestingly enough, both of the aforementioned short treatises were composed in Anglo-Norman, in octosyllabic rhyming couplets, showing first that was quite a connection across the channel anyway. The same English kings spoke French at that point. Other late medieval treatises or manners are preserved only in a single manuscript each. It's also interesting to look at the philological history of the work proper, because sometimes we just know them from later copies, of course, but even in let's say later centuries, sometimes by translation. Again, we've seen before that we don't even have the originals in the original language sometimes. In any case, here we have the Apprises de Nourture, 237 lines, the Bon Enfant, 89 lines, Edward, 332 lines, and Petite Traitise de Nourture, right, 109 lines. So this is essentially sort of pedagogical, philosophical work of the same kind, right? This is typical medieval literature, trying to encompass a bit the entire spectrum of somebody's existence, and mostly of the universe. So what the role that you should have fulfilled in it, right? Following these precepts that were not just seen as, okay, you have to do it for which reason, right? It was understood perfectly well, differently from our shallow times, that there was an ultimate purpose for everyone that also culminated, and so you had your own way, and this treatise, because you were incarnated, following in a certain way that you had to surpass it. So these works were saying, look, if you are like this or like that, try to fix it in this way, because the ultimate purpose, of course, is way beyond this lower dimension. Also, following the lead of Perceval's mother in Chrétien Conte du Graal, poems like Raoul de Houdan's Roman des Ailes, which stands for the Romance of Wings, were in the first third of the 13th century, and the Ordre de Chevalerie in the second half of the 13th. And these were essentially knightly works instructing, in fact, the warriors in the moral lessons of chivalry. The latter plot is fascinating as far as also our crusade warfare in the history content is concerned, because it talks about just the events before the Third Crusade. There is here Prince Hugues II of Tiberias, that is Hugh de Tabarly. That's just the French version, captured in a skirmish by Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt, the king, actually. In this, because it's obviously all translated in a French context. As you know, Saladin had in a bit old Western literature this role of sort of an infidel that, however, was so cool, heroic, noble, chivalrous, etc., that of course, impressively defeating the same king of Jerusalem, recovering in fact the same holy city, was was quite impressively thought of by the same Westerners. And so what happens is that Hugh, during his captivity, instructs Saladin in the order of chivalry, that at least in this case he evidently didn't know quite, so he leads the Sultan through the stages of becoming a proper knight, right? Even though he refuses to give him the accolade, which, of course, here there was all spiritual meaning attached, and the religious difference was important. In the end, Hugh asks the same Saladin essentially for pay for his own ransom, and the king instructs his Muslim emirs to give money to Hugh, who has thus elevated himself to a sort of royal status. And as such, he not only manages to free himself, but also he has money to spare. And this story is, so that's how the thing really goes. It's about a matter of spiritual surpassing, right? Of teaching, of elevation, of course, of fall and rise back through essentially spiritual confidence, culture, and nurturing. And it likely conflates an actual historical event with a legendary one, right, regarding Hugh of Tiberias, who was also Prince of Galilee in 1178-79, and that was actually in fact captured by Saladin on the banks of the Litani River, not far away from the castle of Beaufort. And he was soon released. So this story seems to have been merged with the legion, at least, of Lord Humphrey II of Toron, that was actually a vassal of Hugh's, interestingly enough. It was so impressive for Saladin, for his martial skills, that he literally, like the Sultan asked him to be knighted through this proceeding, the European tradition. So the thing is fascinating here because there is evidently a switch as far as the dedication also of the Ordre de Chevalerie, this work is concerned, which may be connected with the desire to increase the prestige of the House of Saint-Omer that we were just talking about the other day in the video about medieval Flanders, by the way, that thus brought the poet to transfer this legend of the knighting of Saladin from Hugh's vassal to Hugh himself, which may have had some sort of broader implication in the first place, because at least that hierarchy was meaningful from a moral point of view as well. So if the vassal could instruct a sultan in the art of chivalry fundamentally, and it's a spiritual dignity, his lord should have been even more than that, more capable than that. We also have 3 brief poems about table manners. The Contenance de Table, dating from the late 13th century to the 15th, that derived from a Latin model connected with the Liber Faceti, that have to do with being fundamentally tidy, clean, and polite at the table, which is fascinating considering that also most of what we consider today tables manners were barely appearing at this point through the Crusades. Allegedly, the fork was introduced, but it was still used in different ways. In the West, that everything was much more, you ate with your own hands. I mean, French kings would do it until pretty late in time, like Louis XIV did that, and used the knife, the fork actually just to fix the meat while we're cutting it, right? Not to eat it, which you would do it with your hands. There are some meanings that we could talk about, but seems like a digression now. So, as we have already profiled before, courtesy literature sharply divided the roles of men and women. unavoidably and obviously and naturally in tradition. We've seen it in Robert de Blois specifically, who wrote specifically for aristocratic patrons his didactic verses in the mid-13th century. It was really a normal, a usual genre. In his Enseignement de Prince, which is a really sober Christian allegory of what should be the nobiliar virtues, it's formed in different parts. The first, known as the Honneur à Dames, so the honor to the dames, in some manuscripts, where it basically teaches the respect that is owed to women. The other parts describe the moral and religious duty of the nobility, so faith, courage, ardor in combat, elegance, contain spirituality. Right? So as you see, all the traditional qualities required, both from a rational but also an emotional point of view. He basically condemns the vices of the world, envy, like sort of bad talking, right, speaking behind somebody's back, pride, etc. And these were all, of course, poisonous for the conquered of the establishment. And he, for this reason, uses some examples drawn from the Chanson de Geste, say, models of especially military virtue that were universal, especially in this nobiliar feudal context. The romances on Alexander the Great, that was even more important than Caesar actually in ancient epos, and other texts of different type, of course, that fundamentally mix history and romance. This is really, in fact, the fait de roman, the deeds of the Romans, from which deriving exemplary models, right? From the same Robert de Blois, we have the Chastroiement de Dames, which is instead a more, regulatory work for women, alternating between stern moralization and courtly banter about, especially the female sentimental life as such, their amorous activities. And of course these courts were really pretty active in that regard. That's also why this regulation was that strict. It's as if they had been leaving temporarily, and it's interesting also studying the French court throughout the history of how, of course, it was a stock, like this was a thing, as we've seen from Clovis times, the idea of blood being, life being, in this sense, always a tension between the sacred and the profane, good and evil, this heaven and hell, angels and devils, right? And blood was, of course, the same life and seed. And just living at court, think about the scandals that would occur in the Tour de Nesle at the time of Philip IV. They were a bit like in Augustus' times. They had to exile his own daughter because of his own moral regimen that he had issued. Was a real word that was striving for the stars, and of course was called to regulate any kind of misbehavior. But the sense, again, from Carolingian times that kings could have all the women they wanted because they were kings. It was something we're told from ancient Germans that just them could do that. Otherwise, the Germans being pretty monogamic, and this was, of course, a tribal mean at the time to ensure a stronger bond with the center that basically wouldn't exist much otherwise in such societies. But the idea that the kings were sacred, they were children of saints. Think about Saint Louis, etc. They were the rulers of the world, the most powerful, in fact, of Christianity, and having this enormous legacy of bravery, of manliness, of virility in battle, like was all about, as a woman, getting gravitated by them. And being, as they were actually part of the same the same stocks, right? The French didn't have much problem of inbreeding because they were extremely prolific. So also this various branches of the Capetians, because that's exclusively the Capetians. I mean, all the dynasties of France from Hugh Capet onward were all descending from them, right? You know, they had different names after the various vassal titles they had inherited, such as again Valois, Bourbon, etc. But they were always and they always remain, by the way, Capetians till the end. So it was this, even just in France, as we've seen, this enormous Atlantic plain, extremely fertile in soil, but also extremely populated. Well, the elite, the nobility, the royal court was feeling like literally the first mover of this whirlwind, right? Of this enormous life that had to be reinforced and replicated. But of course, women had to be chaste specifically because the right of inheritance, because that's the entire point of it all. You don't if you want to maintain this power connected, you must ensure that your son, your own blood, descends to you, and in this sense the women as gatekeepers of sex are the ones more responsible for that all, and so hence all the regulation. Interestingly enough, the this chastoiement, so the chastising, literally, of the dames, also known as enseignement de dames, the teaching of women, was also very in vogue in other courts for the same reasons, by the way. And it's a mundane code of behavior that the noble women had literally to use, and which, of course, it's not just about sex, but it's the entire, of course, value of the domestic role of the woman, concentrated on etiquette, different levels, manners, modesty. Modesty of the woman was more important. Providing, by the way, advice on beauty as well, on the behavior to follow in love, right? So what is fascinating about this is that as strongly sexed this world actually was, it was also really regulated, right? Like that. So there was always both. It's never about saying, okay, well, they said this, but they did something else, because they really competed for achieving, right, their status through such selection. And that's where things really got interesting, because it was all about also giving them this backbone and sense of effect of value to be that elite, that stock of rulers, right, even in sexual regulation. You have, at least Robert's values are described as today would be like, oh my god, this is so sexist, whatever. But it was actually very sound. He was even mocking a little bit, right? So he has a balance between talent and wit, and he is, of course, fully the man of his times, and these values, in fact, must be understood. Definitely the prevailing moral lens today is not moral at all, so for it cannot even understand history in the first place. In any case, you have also the sense of the enticing threat of female sexuality as a recurrent motive in this works, meaning that, again, the woman represented, and this is also the angelic one in chivalric poems, etc. The transfigured, again, demon of victory, right? That stemmed from the Furies, from the Erinnys, from the anti-orderly, rational, virile order, right? And so the woman had to develop these characteristics to be that fierce, but in that sense being won by the man, once possessed and tamed and transfigured. For both, that of course would acquire much greater value than the sum of the mere humans, that of course are worth nothing in themselves, in the couple, and the new life is generated. There is an interesting advice in the Urbain which advises to marry literate women who are more likely to be faithful. And that's not much to say, that women had to be dumb. That they literally had to cultivate some spiritual force without the patchy sort of secularistic and modernistic mentality that just is an artificial way of being so, right? They had to be of the true stock and simply proving those qualities by nature, rather than some sort of faking, fundamentally. And so this process, also epigenetically, as we are basically discovering in the last decades, was surely providing with a higher quality to the progeny and to the way these people were to be selected, right? At least ideally. Then humanity kept going down, but these were the best of the time. Female instruction is the principal aim of two late 14th century treatises. One is the Livre du Chevalier de la Tour Landry. We are in 1371-72, which was written for his daughters by a knight, right? Also a quite famous one during the 100 Years' War that fought, in fact, for the French king. 128 chapters that warn essentially against the impropriety of extolling courtesy, modesty, interest, and especially chastity and marital fidelity. So that the knight also offers a quite straightforward depiction of what are the luxury temptations and the violent punishments, actually, such as beatings or even death, that follow women's disobedience. And this was really thought to be, say, the normality, at the time, in a very stern way. In fact, it was, of course, a right to honor that entailed, of course, the man to be disposing of the life of his family, right, as he was in charge of that. This is fascinating because he's writing as a father to the daughters, and so instilling fear, both misbehavior, say, from others, but also of mostly themselves. And so what would happen to a disobedient woman? And we do know, of course, that some men would go as far as killing their unfaithful wives, and this work, however, is generally speaking more guiding overall, right? So there is, for example, a description of the behavior that these women would have had to adopt during their visit at the royal court, which was a chance, of course, of being finding their husband, etc. That this is also a dangerous place as a consequence. It's full of courtesans that could dishonor or embarrass the same family. As we've seen, there was an enormous competition, and it was really a pot of snakes. So there is a great fatherly care about his daughters here. He's really warning them quite concretely. And he definitely takes this firm moral stand against the behavior of those that infringe the code of honor. Tells the knight tells his daughters to be wary, especially of the dangers of vanity. Don't, say, enter this void competition in beauty, for example, with the other dames, as far as that can lead nowhere good as a whole. It's a bit like, I don't know, a father today saying to a daughter, stop using that stupid Instagram, right? Posting your pictures publicly for no reason and just becoming an empty-brained idiot in the process, right? And this is essentially, in fact, problems that the youth is faced with today as well. And at the time, especially in these great centers of power where people were much more people than we are today, and so actually full of much more rigidly functional moral codes, still the pressure was so high, right, that it could be crushing. We know of lots of pretty disturbing stories going on, so it's all very complicated, and this knight surely cared very much about his daughters. By the way, his examples that he himself says to have been supplied by 2 priests and 2 clerics, so with a specific spiritual guardianship, are definitely drawn also from the sources of the Bible and history. The fabliaux, that are a metrical tale, typically a boldly humorous one at the same time, right, of a type found chiefly, in fact, in early French poetry, but also even just contemporary life examples, like look what had happened to that girl or to that guy, and just reinforcing the exemplary notion. There is also a lengthy debate between the wife and the knight in this work, right? And interestingly enough, the wife comes to the conclusion that courtly love is a pretty bad place and a dangerous trap for women. So the knight considered this guy was somehow of not at the very top ranks, but he was still in the entourage of the court, so it's the typical story, the naive girl that gets seducted and dishonored, and maybe she had to kill herself. Well, this is definitely what a father does not want at all. And you have actually also the authorship of a similar book for his sons by the same knight, right? But only this one to his daughters have survived, so it would be interesting to see there what he was saying in comparison to the males. We have at least 21 French manuscripts and 2 English translations originally of this Livre du Chevalier de la Tour Landry. One by Caxton, by the way, in 1484. There is also a German printed edition later on in the Renaissance, just to say how also interesting this was for everybody, like not just for knights, right? This could apply to really everyone in the lower echelons of society, as we've seen. There's a very interesting work that is the Ménager de Paris, composed between 1392 and 94. This guy was a wealthy, elderly bourgeois of Paris. So we see here, in a very peculiar moment for the city, this is also the, say, we are in between the 100 Years' War phases, and, Paris would have a central, it would be occupied by the English, the Burgundians later on. So there is a rise also of these elements that, as patricians, fundamentally are still very rich, like in this case, and they are skilled administrators by profession, and they care about their patrimony as much as their family, and they provide with this interesting compendium of moral wisdom and household management for the young wife, as was a bit like normal at the time, right? And the source provides exhaustive details about things like housekeeping, gardening, cooking, the training of servants, horses, hawking. So you see even activities that were mimicking the aristocratic ones for real. So you can say that the Ménager is a sort of treaty of morals and of even domestic economy, which means that you can find their philosophical reflection and practical advice on family life but also on the preservation and of the same and its organization. And so it's within this frame that you have very interesting data, by the way. For example, recipes, how you say that, for the cook of the household, right? Just as for the historians of culinary art, right? You could do that at some point if you're interested. And you have different editions. There is one, the Pichon, which is in 2 volumes fundamentally, so that we can read it, the index, just to make you understand what it's about. Like, there's a prologue of the author, then there is a first distinction containing the 9 articles or chapters, that is to say, saluting and thanking God for just waking up and going to sleep in a good manner, which is actually very, very, very important, as any of us had noise issues in the environment may relate to. Knowing how to, say, associate oneself with good people, right? How to love God, to serve Him and maintain Him within His grace, but also very strongly traditional, spot-on principle. So there is a lot on the Mass, on contrition, on confession, on mortal sins, on the 7 virtues. The merchant instructs how to practice continency and living chastely, right? He makes some examples on different figures, even on the queens of France, and then he talks about and remember, this is a work directed to a woman, right? So specifically, that's the point, how a woman, a good housewife should behave. And there is a list of example of how to be in love with your own husband. There are different examples from the Bible, Eve, Sarah, Rachel, but also on dogs, interestingly enough. The dog Macaire, the dog Niort, that speak of fidelity. And remember that, this was quite a heraldic symbol, really, the dog also used as for identifying very high nobility. So this is not an insult, like, to the woman in that regard, because in the traditional, again, in the zoology of the time and on the bestiaries and so on, that was actually the quality. The woman had to be humble and obedient to her own husband. There is the history of Griselda, by the way, which is drawn from Boccaccio, interestingly enough. It was very read in France. I was pretty much all over in Western Europe. It's a very interesting story because basically this woman is a peasant, and the Marquise of Montferrat, of Saluzzo, actually, marries her, but she wants to test her, and so she humiliates her in a terrible way, actually. But she remains faithful till the end, and he is so moved, and so on. But Boccaccio concludes by saying that, she would have better had a lover, than this sort of paranoid husband that, however, found the truly virtuous woman. In any case, what is harsh there is how she's treated, and you feel for her, really, because she is really good, even though she's a peasant, as we've seen before, right? Even here there is a contrast between the high nobleman and the peasant. But the idea is that if you're pure of heart, you can be noble in your own regard. There are various anecdotes on the wife that let the husband drown, and of course it's not much that it ended badly for him, but also for her later on. On Eve, on Lucifer, on a bourgeois, on the Bailiff of Tournai. So you see here you have the various examples. It's interesting as also for the other works that are similar, mentally, what kind of data you would provide. On the abbots and the martyrs, on the Lady of Andrézel, on the husbands of Bar-sur-Aube, on a cousin of the wife of the author, on the Roman. Then he advises the wife to be curious and premurous for the husband, to how to treat him well, how to clean, how to have an hygienic house fundamentally, how to be discreet. On the on Papyrus, on the woman who was essentially taking care of a hen egg, as a matter of fact, on the Brides of Venice, on a wise Parisian man scammed by the wife, on a notable lawyer. It's all types that he would know, by the way, in person. So how to be, even how to correct the husband when he's mistaken, but doing it without, mistreating him fundamentally. Here there is really lots of examples, so we'll skip some of them. But in any case, having to take care of your menage, on diligence, perseverance, the path of poverty and wealth of Jean Brouillard, of gardening, of knowing how to choose pages, aides, house keepers, fundamentally how to make them work, because the women, of course, were in charge of that. The young woman who speaks in a vulgar way, the care of the house, life in the countryside, different recipes on the domestics, on the horses, knowing how to organize lunch and dinner also as a social event, various events, general terms of kitchen, other list of recipes from the Abbot of Lagny on weddings. This is actually fun to read, how to order, to conversate, and how to make any kind of soup and meat. Other general terms of cooking, spices, and how they go with one another. Meat, soups, roasted meat, pâtés, river, lake fish, different types of fish, like eggs, cooked in different types, different side dishes, fried stuff, sauces, cooked sauces, a beverage for those who were sick, soups for those who were sick, those other little things that are necessary, and even other things that are not really about the topic specifically. But then there is in fact how to nourish and making the hawk fly, the Spanish dogs, the plumage of a hawk, right, etc. This is essentially it, and you understand that the variety of the concerns, even within this bourgeois menagerie, right? And interestingly enough, this work is very, very moral, as staunchly as the Chevalier de la Tour Landry, right? So the menagerie tries to show compassion for example, his wife's mouth, insisting that he would never attempt to test her as Boccaccio's Griselda had been tried, that viciously. Also because the story is ambiguous there, what she should have done as a final moral. So when you look at the night, L'Entrée, for example, in the Ménager of Paris, you realize that there is a somber picture of the constraints placed on young women, generally speaking, and often revealing portraits of, in fact, male attitude about female instruction in the late medieval world, which, especially considering, again, the fact that these were made men, these were young women. Of course, this instruction was quite useful also because the woman was not really in charge of much. She had a dowry, but also the husband often took care of that. And these women were, in this sense here, you see, were also very well off, right? So they really had to learn practically how to manage all this. And it was important to just give them even a customized preference, right? And so people would read it because just it was could give ideas, could say, look, this is how the rich guys really do, and there is a value in it. There is a general idea of even just of the virtues. Without all the wealth, if you they didn't have them. Finally, there is one of the most famous authors of the 15th century, Christine de Pizan. This was a Venetian woman who married with a French lord and entered a very high circle of French nobility as a consequence, as we will see now. And she is mostly famous because of the fact that she was a book writing woman, right? And specifically, like the first woman to write a courtesy book for other women, and reflecting on the role of women on that society. And importantly enough, Christine de Pizan, contrary to all the feministic trash that of course is poured on us continuously, in a despicably unscientific and immoral way, is actually incredibly conservative, right? She has nothing to do with, fighting the patriarchy, whatever that is even supposed to mean, and the, fighting against oppression at all. She actually makes it clear that, of course, women are considered poorly, and there is this idea that they're normally not capable of doing so much by themselves, and even in a regulatory manner at higher levels, and they can't be essentially of higher political thinking, right? But actually, she wants to prove that it's not the case, still remaining in her role, of course, because there was no other, and she was perfectly aware of that, and proud of that as well. There are interesting works. They're quite famous, in fact, if you know the woman, the Trésor de la Cité des Dames, also known as Le Livre de Trois Vertus, in 1405, because essentially this is kind of an ideal world in which women are always virtuous and led by all this perfect moral system, and they're able to regulate a dramatic amount of stuff. This was written for Marguerite of Burgundy, the wife of the Dauphin Louis of Guyenne. This was a big deal, right? Tells you how connected Christine was, and of course the book is also again well known. It defines this moral virtues and duties of women of all conditions and ranks. That's also fascinating, as we will see. There are more political works that explain this sort of corporatistic mentality regarding the monarchy being the body of society directed by God, which the monarch is a medium, etc. So in the full traditional wake. She talks about unmarried and married women, widows, princesses, women of rank, nuns, bourgeois, and peasant wives, even prostitutes, because of course the deal is showing also the negatives, and so getting the best even from the errors of the world, right? Because that's what God teaches us in the first place, just through the living experience of humans. And famously enough, Christine essentially defends passionately, also very well organized and argumentative way, and in different fashion, by the way, in favor of the value of women, right? She rejects those propositions that are opposed to that, and she in fact makes some examples of women that were as famous as virtues as well. The church had already taken in consideration the issue, for example, like, as you know, traditionally a woman alone could not transfigure. That's why marriage was the thing, as we were saying before, but there were examples of virtuous women. The church had taken that into consideration from a very early age, trying to respond to the question, what about them, right? Because technically only men could transcend, or again, it's not just the story, you die, you go either in heaven or in hell. That's the version that never existed historically, not even in the Middle Ages quite per se. It's just an allegory, a metaphor, or whatever you want to call it. It has to do about the role of transfiguring, right? And while, of course, women were, of course, to transfigure together with their men, that's the same reason why at some point, even still recently in Hinduism, women are still killed, burning together with the corpse of their husband if he dies before them. There were the example of saints, female saints. And what about those? Those were married with Christ. And so the idea is, what capacity did that woman have to hopefully, in fact, make it to heaven to a degree, because everybody was, as you see also in Dante's heavens, this is also the traditional thing in different layers, like in different parts of the firmament, in fact. What about this woman? Who is that was really transfiguring her? And so they came up also with the idea that they had allegedly sort of male soul, and yeah, that's bad, I think, considering the current types of ideologies revolving this, but it absolutely, of course, didn't mean that at all. But just for saying that this is not the feministic work that somebody delusionally pretends to have anything to do with. There is, by the way, a follow-up to the La Cité des Dames, Les Trésors de la Cité des Dames by Christine, that states in here to have terminated the previous work and having felt just this great need to rest right after writing it. But she was essentially haunted by the three dames of virtue that are reason, righteousness, and justice, that had basically assisted her for the writing of already of the La Cité des Dames, and that essentially prompted her, invited her to continue the work, and so she accepted for the purpose of female education, interestingly enough. And the most ancient illuminations of the book that still exist, by the way, this is beautiful, because they were supervised by Christine herself, right? That's normally how you called a miniaturist, and you would tell him, because also the same manuscripts were very much ad hoc, and they would be copied, but here we're still in times in which things were done, especially at these higher levels, with that sort of one shot, right, in just to show the beauty, etc. And you have, in fact, Christine represented in bed there, is trying to rest, but the three virtues are, and I uploaded the picture also here, they are at her left, and they pull her from that part of the bed with their arms. And of course, Christine's message to women is no less conservative in any way than that of her male predecessors, right? You cannot best say that the style is more refined. There is, of course, a welcome, more sensitive touch of femininity in her style, right? Like the Chevalier de la Tour Landry, Christine sternly condemns amorous intrigues and loathes chastity, marital fidelity, as well as obedience, right? The full traditional role of men and women is potently, gloriously, and honorably affirmed, and none of her work is against it whatsoever, right? She advocates women of all, as we've seen, extraction, because she's talking really at once from all social status, must help their husbands in their duties, however exalted or humble they may be, right? This is particularly important. Christine also sets forth principles for the instruction of princes, knights, and men of all fact extractions in this other Livre du Corps de Policy, written in 1407. This is quite interesting because, as we've seen also in the videos about medieval warfare, very often, largely, when was it? Recently, in that one about the scalar increase in the use of artillery, from the 15th century, we have Christine's insights about how, for example, a citadel should be armed, etc. But the most important thing about the work is, again, the sense that society, in the way it's traditionally organized, is divinely ordered, and kings must follow effectively this standards, as well as the rest of society. She's quite thoughtful of all. In fact, the estates that make part constitute it, including the peasantry, the lowest elements that provide the supplies, etc. So, of course, everybody knew, right? It's a disgustingly classistic myth invented by radically undereducated and especially existentially frustrated Marxists that do not understand practically anything about the most common cultural basis. That, of course, there is a deep awareness of the nobility, of all the potential of the entire system. They were in charge of that. They made it work, and those people worked for them because they knew that that's how things would work, right? And there was not another way to do it. And Christine's legacy is enormous. Consider that a century after her works, and the Bourbonnois adopted Christine's precepts for noble women, along with those of Louis IX, the saint, in her book of instruction for her daughter. There was Suzanne de Bourbon. Anne de Bourbonnois was actually Charles VIII's sister. Suzanne would marry Charles III of Bourbon. By the way, it was the guy that was shot in half by a falconet operated by Cellini at the siege of Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome during the sack of 1527. This is quite fascinating. And still, in the full Renaissance, you have these works inspired to Christine, specifically Anne's one, Les Enseignements d'Anne de France. We are in 1504, 1505. Right. Sadly, Suzanne would die at 29, but that's also the meager reality of the time as far as survival rates and just life expectancy in general. As we were just noticing and remembering, medieval courtesy books continued to be read in the Renaissance. Right, when several appeared, for example, in printed editions, meaning that people really wanted to read them at different levels. They served as sources really for Renaissance treatises on gentility in general. And you can't argue the genre went on as such. Their popularity attests to the tensions and anxieties, of course, surrounding the changing of society at the time. The Renaissance, of course, is celebrated positivistically in a way that was the diametrically opposite way for all those who lived in it. That is to say, one of the single most traumatic periods of uncertainty, lack of center, of complete disaster, the split of Christendom, the Ottoman invasion. Right, so you can understand why these models that were drawing really from the most obvious traditional values were so important. And of course, the elite that still was in charge would remain for centuries, was particularly aware of not just of the existence of these works, but of course of the necessity of such values to keep working. Right, and after all, things are not, well, they had changed a lot, but in the essentials, right, still the idea of a ruler having to be a warrior by some degree, right, something that really goes on for a long time, especially in the majority of Europe, and from being always predictable, this compendia of stereotypes, these diverse works, of course, offer an inextinguishable almost amount of information from, as we've seen, the 12th century to the 15th, the beginning of the modern age, and revealing really some of the most insightful criticism of the complexity, also in views of daily life at the time. So customs, the sexual and social mores, as well as also an ironic commentary about human nature as such. Like the idea that, again, all this is a matter of knowing how to handle yourself, and you have to take it with a bit of, not of fatalism actually, but conviction in itself, but realizing that we are in this frightening condition, and we have to make the best of our resources, right? And so still being serious, right, sticking to this powerful model is quite an important issue that must be revived, evaluated, passed down to the next generations. And so this evidently succeeded to not just as a genre, but even the same works that we read today. So I think it's all quite fascinating. We've seen the progression from the high medieval, still sort of warlike forms of knightly, chivalric, say competition in that mess that was not still regulated, and we realized these works really show the progression of that to some of the most solidly, dominated ancien regime systems, right? And in a time in which these models were being revived even at sort of higher level scale compared to the one, in fact, this higher nobility had really reached. All right. It's always interesting to talk every once in a while about literature. Today, however, stop it here. Hope we'll continue to talk about them in the future, as much as that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.